The night was a symphony of chaos, a cacophony of neon lights and thumping bass that pulsed through the veins of the city like a fever dream. The air was thick with the scent of spilled liquor, burnt synth flesh from food stalls, and the faint metallic tang of rain that never quite fell. It was the kind of night where the universe felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something, or someone, to tip the scales. And that someone was a poor, drunk human boy named Kale. Kale was a mess. But he was a mess with a story. At 23, he had already lived a life that felt too heavy for his narrow shoulders. He was a scavenger by trade, picking through the wreckage of derelict starships and abandoned colonies, selling whatever he could to keep the lights on in his cramped, rusting hab unit. His life was a patchwork of near misses and almost wins, a series of bad decisions strung together by the thin thread of hope that maybe, just maybe, tomorrow would be different. But tonight, hope was the last thing on his mind. Tonight, he was drowning in cheap synth whiskey, trying to forget the latest in a long line of failures. The bar was called the Rusted Nebula, a dive so far on the outskirts of the city that it might as well have been in another galaxy. It was the kind of place where the walls seemed to sweat desperation, and the patrons were a mix of down-on-their-luck spacers, rogue traders, and the occasional bounty hunter looking for a quick score. Kale sat slumped at the bar, his head resting on the sticky surface, his fingers tracing the rim of a glass that had been empty for far too long. His dark hair was a tangled mess, and his eyes, usually a sharp, piercing green, were dull and bloodshot. "Another one," he slurred, tapping the glass with a shaky hand. The bartender, a grizzled alien with skin like cracked leather, gave him a look that was equal parts pity and disdain but poured him another drink anyway. Kale didn't care about the judgment. He was too far gone to care about much of anything. The world around him was a blur of sound and color, but his mind was a storm of regret and self-loathing. He thought about the job he'd botched last week, a simple retrieval mission that had gone sideways when he'd trusted the wrong person. He thought about the debt he owed to a particularly unpleasant crime lord who didn't take kindly to excuses. And he thought about the fact that he was utterly, completely alone in a universe that didn't give a damn about him. But then, as if the cosmos had decided to take pity on him, or maybe just mess with him a little more, something happened. The door to the bar slammed open, and a gust of cold air swept through the room, carrying with it the scent of ozone and something else, something wild and untamed. Kale lifted his head, squinting through the haze of alcohol, and saw her. She was unlike anyone, or anything he had ever seen. Tall and regal, with skin that shimmered like molten gold and eyes that burned with an inner fire, she moved through the room with a grace that was almost otherworldly. Her hair, a cascade of silver and blue, seemed to catch the light in a way that defied physics, and the faint glow of bioluminescent markings traced patterns across her skin that shifted and changed as she walked. She was dressed in a flowing gown that seemed to be made of starlight itself, and the air around her crackled with an energy that made the hair on the back of Kale's neck stand on end. For a moment, the entire bar seemed to hold its breath. Even the music faltered, the bass stuttering before resuming its relentless beat. Kale couldn't look away. He felt like he was caught in a gravity well, pulled inexorably toward her. And then, as if sensing his gaze, she turned and looked directly at him. Their eyes met, and Kale felt something shift inside him, something deep and primal. It was as if the universe had realigned itself, and he was suddenly, acutely aware of how small and insignificant he was in the grand scheme of things. But there was something else too, something he couldn't quite put into words. It was like looking into the heart of a star and realizing that, for all its brilliance, it was just as lonely as he was. She smiled, a slow, predatory smile that sent a shiver down his spine, and then she was moving toward him, her every step a study in controlled power. Kale's heart was pounding in his chest, and he suddenly felt very, very sober. "You," she said, her voice a low purr that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. "You're coming with me." Kale opened his mouth to protest, to ask what the hell she was talking about, but before he could get a word out, she grabbed him by the arm and pulled him to his feet. Her grip was like iron, and he stumbled after her, too stunned to resist. The bar patrons watched in silence as she dragged him toward the door, their expressions a mix of awe and fear. And then they were outside, the cold night air hitting Kale like a slap in the face. He blinked, trying to clear his head, but before he could get his bearings, she shoved him into a sleek, black hovercraft that looked like it cost more than he'd make in a lifetime. The door slammed shut behind him, and then they were moving, the city lights blurring into streaks of color as the hovercraft shot into the sky. Cale's stomach lurched, and he gripped the edge of the seat, his knuckles white. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "Who are you? Where are you taking me?" She turned to look at him, her eyes glowing with an intensity that made his breath catch. "My name is Zoria," she said, her voice low and melodic. "And you, Cale, are about to find out what it means to be in the wrong place at the wrong time." And with that, the hovercraft shot into the stars, leaving the city, and Cale's old life, far behind. The hovercraft tore through the atmosphere like a comet, leaving a trail of shimmering light in its wake. Cale's stomach churned as the G-forces pressed him into the plush seat, his mind spinning faster than the craft itself. He clutched the armrests, his knuckles white, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The city below became a distant mosaic of glowing grids and shadowy voids, and then it was gone entirely, swallowed by the vast, star-strewn expanse of space. Zoria sat across from him, her posture relaxed, her gaze fixed on the viewport as if this were just another routine flight. Her presence was overwhelming, a force of nature contained within a humanoid form. The faint glow of her bioluminescent markings pulsed rhythmically, casting soft, shifting patterns across the interior of the hovercraft. Cale couldn't decide if she was the most beautiful or the most terrifying thing he'd ever seen. Maybe both. "Where are you taking me?" he demanded again, his voice cracking under the weight of his fear. "What do you want with me?" Zoria turned her head slowly, her eyes locking onto his. There was something ancient in her gaze, something that made Cale feel like an insect under a microscope. "You ask too many questions, little human," she said, her voice a low, melodic hum that seemed to resonate in his chest. "For now, all you need to know is that you are an unexpected variable." "An unexpected variable?" Cale repeated, his voice rising in pitch. "What the hell does that mean?" She didn't answer. Instead, she leaned back in her seat, her lips curling into a faint, enigmatic smile. The hovercraft banked sharply, and Cale's stomach lurched again as they approached a massive structure that loomed in the distance. It was a ship, but unlike any he'd ever seen. Sleek and angular, it glowed with an otherworldly light, its surface shifting and rippling like liquid metal. It was both beautiful and terrifying, a monument to technology that far surpassed anything humanity had ever dreamed of. As they drew closer, Cale realized just how massive the ship was. It dwarfed the hovercraft, its scale incomprehensible. He felt a pang of awe, quickly followed by a surge of dread. Whatever this was, it was far beyond his understanding, and far beyond his control. The hovercraft docked with a soft hiss, and the doors slid open to reveal a corridor bathed in soft, golden light. Zoria stood, her movements fluid and deliberate, and gestured for Cale to follow. He hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to run, but where would he go? They were in the middle of space, and he was completely at her mercy. Swallowing his fear, he stumbled after her, his legs still unsteady from the flight. The interior of the ship was even more breathtaking than the exterior. The walls seemed to be made of some kind of living material, pulsing faintly with light and warmth. The air was thick with the scent of something sweet and metallic, and the faint hum of energy vibrated through the floor beneath his feet. Cale felt like he'd stepped into a dream, or maybe a nightmare. Zoria led him through a series of winding corridors, each more opulent than the last. The ship was a labyrinth of light and shadow, its architecture both alien and strangely familiar. Cale couldn't shake the feeling that the ship was alive, watching him, studying him. It made his skin crawl. Finally, they reached a large, circular chamber. The walls were lined with intricate carvings that seemed to shift and change as he looked at them, and the ceiling was a dome of swirling colors that mimicked the night sky. In the center of the room was a raised platform, and on that platform was a bed. It wasn't just any bed, it was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, its frame made of what looked like polished obsidian, its sheets a shimmering fabric that seemed to glow with an inner light. Cale stared at it, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. What is this?" he stammered. Zoria stepped closer, her presence filling the room. "This," she said, her voice low and velvety, "is where you will sleep." "Sleep?" Kale repeated, his voice rising in disbelief. You dragged me across the galaxy to sleep? Zoria's smile widened, revealing sharp, pearlescent teeth. Not just sleep, she said, her tone dripping with amusement. You are here because you are unique. Unique. Kale echoed, his mind racing. What are you talking about? She stepped closer, her eyes boring into his. You are human, she said, as if that explained everything. And humans are unpredictable, fragile. Yet somehow you endure. You survive. You adapt. It is fascinating. Kale took a step back, his heart pounding. I'm not fascinating, he said, his voice trembling. I'm just a guy. A nobody. I don't know what you want from me, but you've got the wrong person. Zoria tilted her head, her expression unreadable. We shall see, she said softly. Then, without warning, she reached out and placed a hand on his chest. Her touch was warm, almost electric, and Kale felt a strange sensation ripple through him, like a current of energy flowing from her into him. He gasped, his knees buckling, but she caught him before he could fall. Her strength was astonishing, her grip firm but gentle. She guided him to the bed, easing him down onto the soft, glowing sheets. Kale's head spun, his thoughts jumbled and incoherent. He wanted to protest, to fight, but his body felt heavy, his limbs like lead. Sleep, Zoria murmured, her voice a soothing lullaby. You are safe here. For now. Kale wanted to argue, to demand answers, but his eyelids were already drooping, his mind slipping into darkness. The last thing he saw before he lost consciousness was Zoria's face, her golden eyes glowing like twin suns, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. As he drifted into sleep, he dreamed of fire and stars, of a sky full of light and a voice that whispered his name. And somewhere, deep in the recesses of his mind, he wondered if he would ever wake up. Kale woke to the sound of silence, a deep, resonant quiet that felt almost unnatural. His head throbbed, a dull ache that pulsed in time with his heartbeat, and his mouth was dry, his tongue sticking to the roof of his mouth like sandpaper. For a moment, he lay still, his eyes closed, trying to piece together where he was and how he'd gotten there. The memories came in fragments. The bar, the hovercraft, the ship, Zoria, her golden eyes, her voice, her touch. It all felt like a dream, but the bed beneath him was real, its soft, glowing sheets cool against his skin. He opened his eyes and immediately regretted it. The light in the room was soft, but it still felt like a knife stabbing into his brain. He groaned, shielding his face with his arm, and slowly sat up. The room was just as he remembered it. Circular, with walls that seemed to breathe and a ceiling that mimicked the night sky. The carvings on the walls shifted and changed, their patterns hypnotic, and the air was thick with the scent of something sweet and metallic. Kale swung his legs over the side of the bed, his feet brushing against the smooth, warm floor. He felt disoriented, his body heavy and uncoordinated, but he forced himself to stand. He needed to get out of here, to find a way off this ship and back to whatever passed for normal in his life. But as he took a step forward, the room seemed to shift around him, the walls closing in, the light dimming. He stumbled, catching himself on the edge of the bed, and took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. You're awake. The voice came from behind him, low and melodic, and Kale froze. He turned slowly, his heart pounding, and saw Zoria standing in the doorway. She was dressed differently now, her flowing gown replaced by a sleek, form-fitting suit that shimmered like liquid silver. Her hair was pulled back, revealing the sharp angles of her face, and her eyes glowed with that same, unsettling intensity. Where am I? Kale asked, his voice hoarse. What do you want from me? Zoria stepped into the room, her movements graceful and deliberate. You are on my ship, she said, as if that explained everything. And what I want from you is still to be determined. Kale took a step back, his mind racing. Look, I don't know who you think I am, but I'm nobody. I'm just a scavenger. I don't have anything you could possibly want. Zoria tilted her head, her expression unreadable. You underestimate yourself, Kale, she said softly. There is more to you than you realize. Kale shook his head, his frustration mounting. You're not making any sense. Why did you bring me here? What's going on? Zoria didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked over to the bed and ran a hand over the sheets, her touch almost reverent. This ship, she said, her voice distant, is more than just a vessel. It is a living thing, a being of immense power and intelligence. And it has chosen you. Chosen me? Kale repeated, his voice rising. For what? Zoria turned to look at him, her golden eyes burning with an intensity that made his breath catch. For a purpose, she said. A purpose that even I do not fully understand. But the ship has seen something in you, something rare and valuable. And I trust its judgment. Kale stared at her, his mind reeling. This had to be some kind of mistake. He was just a guy, a nobody from the wrong side of the galaxy. He wasn't special. He wasn't chosen. He was just Kale. I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding, he said, his voice trembling. I'm not who you think I am. I'm not. I'm not anything. Zoria stepped closer, her presence filling the room. You are more than you know, she said, her voice low and velvety. And in time, you will come to understand that. Kale wanted to argue, to protest, but the words caught in his throat. There was something in her gaze, something ancient and knowing, that made him feel small and insignificant. He looked away, his eyes falling to the floor, and took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. What happens now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Zoria reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch warm and electric. Now, she said, you will learn. You will grow. And you will discover the truth of who you are. Kale looked up at her, his heart pounding. And if I don't want to? Zoria's smile was slow and predatory, sending a shiver down his spine. You don't have a choice, she said softly. The ship has chosen you, and there is no escaping its will. Kale felt a surge of panic, his instincts screaming at him to run, but he knew it was futile. He was trapped, caught in a web of forces he didn't understand. And as much as he wanted to fight, to resist, he couldn't shake the feeling that Zoria was right. There was no escaping this. Come, Zoria said, her voice gentle but firm. There is much to see, and little time. Kale hesitated, his mind racing, but in the end, he had no choice. He followed her out of the room, his heart heavy with dread and his mind full of questions. The ship's corridor stretched out before him, a labyrinth of light and shadow, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something far bigger, and far more dangerous, than he could possibly imagine. As they walked, Zoria began to speak, her voice a low, melodic hum that seemed to resonate in his chest. She told him of the ship's origins, of its creators, an ancient race of beings who had long since vanished from the galaxy. She spoke of its purpose, its mission, and of the role he was meant to play. Kale listened, his mind struggling to process the enormity of it all, but one thing was clear: his life would never be the same. And as they reached the heart of the ship, a vast glowing chamber filled with swirling light and pulsating energy, Kale realized that he was no longer just a poor, drunk human boy. He was something more. Something else. But whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, he couldn't yet say. The chamber was alive. That was the only way Kale could describe it. The walls pulsed with a rhythmic, almost organic energy, and the air was thick with the scent of ozone and something else, something ancient and powerful. The light in the room shifted and swirled, casting strange dancing shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Kale felt like he was standing inside the heart of a star, surrounded by a force he couldn't begin to comprehend. Zoria stood beside him, her presence both comforting and unnerving. She was calm, her expression serene, as if this were just another day in her extraordinary life. Kale, on the other hand, felt like he was teetering on the edge of a precipice, one wrong step away from falling into the abyss. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The core," Zoria replied, her tone reverent. "The heart of the ship. It is here that the vessel's consciousness resides. It is here that you will begin to understand." Kale swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Understand what?" Zoria turned to look at him, her golden eyes glowing with an intensity that made his breath catch. "Your purpose," she said simply. Cale wanted to protest, to tell her that he didn't have a purpose, that he was just a scavenger, a nobody. But the words died on his lips as the room around him began to change. The light grew brighter, the air thicker, and the walls seemed to close in, their surfaces rippling like water. He felt a strange pull, a sensation that started in his chest and spread outward, like a current dragging him under. "What's happening?" he gasped, his voice trembling. "The ship is connecting with you," Zoria explained, her voice calm and steady. "It is reaching out, trying to communicate. Do not fight it." Cale wanted to argue, to tell her that he didn't want this, that he wasn't ready. But before he could speak, the room erupted in light. It was blinding, overwhelming, and Cale threw up his arms to shield his eyes. But the light wasn't just outside him, it was inside him, filling his mind, his body, his very soul. He felt a surge of energy, a rush of power that made his skin tingle and his heart race. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The room was silent, the light dimmed, and Cale stood there, trembling, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He felt different. He couldn't explain it, but something inside him had shifted, changed. It was like waking up from a dream and realizing that the world wasn't quite the same as it had been before. What was that?" he asked, his voice shaking. Zoria stepped closer, her expression unreadable. "The ship has accepted you," she said. "It has chosen you as its companion." "Companion?" Cale repeated, his mind racing. "What does that mean?" Zoria's smile was slow and enigmatic. "It means that you are now a part of the ship, and it is a part of you. Your minds are linked, your fates intertwined. You will share its thoughts, its memories, its power." Cale stared at her, his heart pounding. "I don't want this," he said, his voice rising in panic. "I didn't ask for this. I just want to go home." Zoria's expression softened, and for a moment, she almost looked sympathetic. "I understand your fear," she said gently. "But this is not something you can walk away from. The ship has chosen you, and there is no going back." Cale felt a surge of anger, his fear giving way to frustration. "You don't get to decide that," he snapped. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for any of this." Zoria's gaze hardened, and for a moment, Cale thought she might strike him. But instead, she stepped closer, her presence overwhelming. "You think this is about choice," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "You think any of us have a choice? The universe does not care about your desires, Cale. It does not care about your fears. It only cares about balance. And right now, you are a part of that balance." Cale wanted to argue, to fight, but he knew it was futile. He was trapped, caught in a web of forces he couldn't control. And as much as he wanted to resist, he couldn't shake the feeling that Zoria was right. This wasn't about him. This was bigger than him. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Zoria's expression softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch warm and electric. "You learn," she said. "You adapt. And you become what the ship needs you to be." Cale took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He didn't know what that meant, didn't know what the future held. But he knew one thing. He couldn't run from this. He had to face it, whatever it was. "Okay," he said, his voice trembling. "What now?" Zoria's smile was slow and enigmatic. "Now," she said, "we begin." And with that, she turned and walked deeper into the chamber, her movements graceful and deliberate. Cale hesitated for a moment, his heart pounding, and then followed her, his mind racing with questions and fears. The light in the room shifted and swirled around him, and he felt the ship's presence in his mind, a faint, pulsing warmth that was both comforting and unnerving. As they walked, Zoria began to speak, her voice a low, melodic hum that seemed to resonate in his chest. She told him of the ship's history, of the ancient race that had created it, and of the role it played in the balance of the universe. She spoke of its power, its intelligence, and of the bond that now connected him to it. Cale listened, his mind struggling to process the enormity of it all, but one thing was clear: his life would never be the same. And as they reached the center of the chamber, a glowing, pulsating orb of light that seemed to radiate pure energy. Cale realized that he was no longer just a poor, drunk human boy. He was something more. Something else. But whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, he couldn't yet say. The orb of light at the center of the chamber pulsed like a living heart, its rhythm syncing with Cale's own. He could feel it, the ship's consciousness, threaded through his mind, a presence both alien and intimate. It whispered to him in a language he didn't understand, yet somehow knew. Images flashed before his eyes, galaxies being born and dying, civilizations rising and falling, the endless ebb and flow of cosmic forces. It was overwhelming, beautiful, and terrifying all at once. Zoria stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the orb. "This is the Nexus," she said, her voice reverent. "The source of the ship's power. And now it is yours to command." Cale shook his head, his chest tightening. "I don't know how to command anything. I'm not like you. I'm not a god or a warrior or whatever you think I am. I'm just a guy." Zoria turned to him, her golden eyes blazing. "You are more than you know," she said, her voice sharp. "The ship chose you for a reason. It saw something in you, strength, resilience, the ability to adapt. You may not believe it, but you are exactly what this moment requires." Cale wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but the words caught in his throat. The orb's light grew brighter, its pulses more urgent, and he felt a sudden searing pain in his chest. He gasped, clutching at his heart, as the ship's voice roared in his mind. Danger. Imbalance. Threat. The chamber shuddered, the walls rippling like water, and the light dimmed as if something had drained its energy. Zoria's expression darkened, her body tensing. "They found us," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "Who?" Cale asked, his voice trembling. "The Voidborn," she replied, her tone grim. "An ancient enemy. They seek to destroy the Nexus and plunge the galaxy into chaos. And they will stop at nothing to achieve it." Before Cale could respond, the ship lurched violently, throwing him to the ground. Alarms blared, their shrill tones piercing the air, and the chamber's light flickered erratically. Zoria grabbed his arm, pulling him to his feet. "We don't have much time," she said. "You must connect with the Nexus. Only you can stop them." Cale stared at her, his mind racing. "Oh, I don't even know what I'm doing." "You don't need to know," Zoria said, her voice firm. "The ship will guide you. Trust it. Trust yourself." Cale wanted to protest, to tell her he couldn't do this, but the urgency in her eyes silenced him. He turned to the orb, its light now faint and flickering, and stepped closer. The pain in his chest intensified, but so did the connection. He could feel the ship's presence more clearly now, its voice a steady hum in his mind. "Focus. Breathe. Become." Cale closed his eyes, forcing himself to calm down. He took a deep breath, letting the ship's energy flow through him. The images returned, faster and more vivid this time. He saw the Voidborn, shadowy, formless entities that devoured light and life. He saw their ships, dark and jagged, closing in on the Nexus. And he saw what would happen if they succeeded: a galaxy consumed by darkness, a universe thrown into chaos. "No," he whispered, his voice firm. "I won't let that happen." The orb's light surged, its pulses growing stronger, and Cale felt a surge of power unlike anything he'd ever experienced. It was as if the ship had opened a floodgate, pouring its energy into him. His body glowed, his skin shimmering with the same golden light as Zoria's, and his mind expanded, reaching out to the ship systems. He could see everything, the Voidborn ships closing in, their weapons charging, their intent clear. He could feel the Nexus, its power vast and untapped, waiting for his command. And he could feel Zoria beside him, her presence steady and unwavering. "Do it," she said, her voice a whisper. "Save us." Cale nodded, his resolve hardening. He reached out with his mind, tapping into the Nexus's power. The ship responded instantly, its systems coming alive. Weapons fired, shields activated, and the Voidborn ships were met with a barrage of energy that tore through their ranks. But it wasn't enough. They kept coming, their numbers overwhelming. Kale gritted his teeth, pushing harder. He could feel the strain, the ship's energy draining him, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. He focused on the Nexus, channeling its power, and unleashed a wave of energy that rippled through space. The Void-born ships were caught in the blast, their forms disintegrating into nothingness. The chamber shook, the light dimming as the Nexus expended its energy, but the threat was gone. Kale collapsed to his knees, his body trembling, his mind reeling. The connection to the ship faded, the orb's light returning to its gentle pulse. Zoria knelt beside him, her hand on his shoulder. "You did it," she said, her voice filled with awe. "You saved us." Kale looked up at her, his vision blurry. I didn't think I could." Zoria smiled, her expression softer than he'd ever seen it. "You are stronger than you know," she said. "And now, you are a part of something greater." Kale took a deep breath, his body slowly recovering. He looked around the chamber, the walls now steady, the light calm. He could still feel the ship's presence in his mind, a faint, comforting warmth. And for the first time, he didn't feel like a nobody. He felt different, changed. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice quiet. Zoria stood, offering him a hand. "Now," she said, "we rebuild. We prepare. The Voidborn may be gone, but there will always be threats. And we will face them together." Kale took her hand, letting her pull him to his feet. He felt a sense of purpose, a clarity he'd never known before. He wasn't just a scavenger anymore. He was a guardian, a protector. And he was ready to embrace that role. As they left the chamber, the ship's corridors glowing softly around them, Kale felt a strange sense of peace. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. He was no longer alone. He had Zoria. He had the ship. And he had a purpose. The stars stretched out before them, infinite and uncharted, and Kale felt a spark of excitement. The universe was vast and full of wonders, and he was ready to explore it, not as a poor, drunk human boy, but as something more. Something extraordinary. And as the ship soared into the stars, Kale smiled, his heart full of hope. The journey was just beginning.